For years, the contents of Queen Elizabeth II's private will were the subject of palace whispers. But no one, not even Charles, expected what lay hidden in the velvet-lined box. The Queen's final act wasn't just symbolic, it shattered tradition and set the stage for a royal storm. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. In the inner sanctums of the palace, behind closed doors and centuries-old silence, a singular envelope emerged. Sealed with the Queen's personal crest and addressed only to Princess Anne, it was handed over by a long-serving royal aide mere moments after the official reading of the will concluded. No one else, not the king, not Camilla, knew what was inside. But the unease in the room was unmistakable. Charles, flanked by his advisors, had expected formality and closure. What he got was uncertainty. That envelope, deliberately withheld from public protocol, unleashed a wave of speculation that reached far beyond the monarchy's walls. A former footman, speaking anonymously, claimed he once overheard the Queen confide in her daughter, calling Anne "my steel backbone," a phrase never meant for public ears, but now burning in the subtext of this unprecedented decision. Behind the scenes, records later revealed Anne had been granted increased access to the royal vault in the final weeks of her mother's life. Palace staff noted her repeated visits, each carefully logged, each unexplained. At the time, it seemed like nothing more than grief cloaked in ritual. But in hindsight, it was preparation. There was something she was meant to retrieve, something only she was trusted to carry. And when the official contents of the Queen's will were read, titles, properties, holdings, one category stood conspicuously missing. The crown jewels passed down through personal bequest. Then came the moment Camilla would never forget. With no announcement, no legal pageantry, a senior clerk stood and quietly handed the velvet box to Anne. Inside, the most iconic heirlooms of the Queen's private collection passed not to the Queen consort, but to her daughter. The shock on Camilla's face didn't go unnoticed. Those in attendance described a visible shift in her demeanor, a tightening jaw, a flicker of disbelief. She had assumed, like many, that the collection would fall naturally to her. But nature had no place here. This wasn't tradition. This was strategy. Camilla's silence, once a tool of royal discipline, began to crack in the days that followed. Internally, aides described a frost setting in between the Queen consort and the Princess Royal, one that no amount of diplomacy could thaw. What had once been polite distance now simmered into open resentment. And though the palace issued no formal statements, the gesture spoke louder than any proclamation. But the Queen's final gift was more than sentiment, it was a weapon, and Princess Anne now held it in her hands. These weren't just heirlooms, they were symbols of control. From coronation diamonds to intimate brooches, each piece told a story. And now, every story belonged to Anne. The collection wasn't just inherited, it was claimed. Within the royal family, jewelry is never merely ornamental. These are not just accessories, they are emblems of power, tradition, and coded messaging that have silently dictated palace hierarchies for generations. From Queen Victoria's mourning jewels to Elizabeth II's sapphire brooch worn on her wedding day, every stone carries weight. And now, in the wake of Elizabeth's passing, those glittering artifacts were no longer symbols of shared legacy, but contested ground. When the royal vault was reopened and inventories reconciled, the outcome stunned even insiders. Anne hadn't inherited a token or two. She had taken possession of the crown's most storied treasures. Queen Mary's grand tiara, long rumoured to be destined for the Queen consort, was instead placed in Anne's care. The Greville emeralds, worn only on the most formal occasions, were similarly transferred. Even the beloved sapphire brooch, last seen pinned to Elizabeth's funeral coat, had been quietly reassigned to Anne's permanent collection. The decision bypassed Camilla completely. Not one item was formally passed down to her through the late Queen's instructions. Vault records, reviewed by royal aides, showed the reallocation had been signed off before the Queen's death. No loopholes, no debate, no avenue for reversal. For Camilla, this wasn't just unexpected, it was a humiliation. Members of her inner circle allegedly described the move as a calculated insult, a deliberate message that, even in death, the Queen had chosen her daughter over the woman now wearing the crown. But what stung most wasn't the transfer, it was Anne's refusal to compromise. When quietly asked by palace intermediaries if she might be willing to loan or return select items, Anne is said to have responded with calm but steely finality. "These were entrusted to me. I won't undo my mother's wishes." In the public eye, it may have seemed a small, elegant reshuffling, but inside palace walls, it became a quiet war. Jewelry, once worn as statements of unity, now became weapons in a battle of legacy. Every time Anne stepped out wearing a brooch once associated with Elizabeth, it sent a signal. Every time Camilla appeared without the expected regalia, it whispered of something lost. The monarchy, so rooted in the appearance of continuity, now found itself fractured not by speeches or scandals but by sapphires and emeralds. The jewels that had once connected generations were now dividing them. Anne was no longer just the keeper of her mother's memory, she was the keeper of her mother's message. And the message was clear. As Anne wore her mother's diamonds with quiet defiance, Camilla began a campaign not of confrontation but of reclamation. Behind the palace walls, Camilla exploded, not just at the decision but at the symbolism. In private, aides say her words cut through protocol like glass. "This changes everything." And she meant it. The briefing was meant to be routine, another formal update in the wake of Queen Elizabeth's passing. But when Camilla learned that the jewelry collection she quietly expected to inherit had been rerouted, not to her, but to Anne, the atmosphere shifted from ceremonial to combustible. Sources close to the matter confirm she was blindsided, never given warning, never consulted, never even offered a symbolic piece to honor her new role as Queen Consort. For Camilla, who had spent decades clawing her way from scandal to acceptance, this was more than a snub. It was a retraction of legitimacy. Aides overheard what they described as a searing argument between Camilla and Charles behind tightly closed doors in the palace's north wing. While exact words remain unconfirmed, one phrase made its way through the walls. "She made her choice, and it wasn't me." Adding fuel to the fire, personal letters once thought private surfaced, revealing that Camilla had corresponded with Queen Elizabeth in the months before her death, delicately broaching the topic of heirlooms and what legacy she might inherit. The letters, polite but unmistakably pointed, were never answered directly. Now, in the light of Anne's unexpected inheritance, they read like silent pleas that were deliberately ignored. In response, Camilla's PR machine kicked into high gear. Tabloid stories began appearing, all tracing a carefully curated narrative. Camilla's deep emotional bond with the Queen, her humble acceptance of any outcome, and her quiet grace in the face of change. But behind the headlines, tension was mounting. The situation reached a boiling point when Anne appeared at a veterans event wearing the Greville Emeralds, a set long associated with formal state duties. Cameras captured every glint of the gems, but what they didn't capture was Camilla's expression as she watched from the sidelines, wearing noticeably pared-down accessories. Rumors soon swirled that Camilla had attempted to request use of certain items for upcoming international visits, only to be told that the pieces were now permanently reassigned. Whispers turned to full-throated speculation. Was Anne making a move not just for the jewels, but for a symbolic dominance within the firm? Caught in the middle was Charles. His silence was deafening. Privately, aides suggested he was attempting to broker peace, but publicly, he said nothing. And in a monarchy where every unspoken gesture speaks volumes, his refusal to defend Camilla or question Anne's right set off alarms across the royal landscape. It wasn't just about diamonds or rubies anymore. This was about standing, about history, about rewriting the monarchy's future through acts disguised as tradition. But Camilla wasn't the only one outraged, because others in the firm feared what Anne might do next. For all the titles, crowns and ceremonies was Camilla ever more than tolerated. The Queen's final gesture now raised a darker question. Did Elizabeth ever see her as a true successor, or just a placeholder? From the moment Camilla entered the royal fold, she was met not with a warm welcome, but with wary silence. Though the official narrative softened over time, royal insiders knew the resistance ran deep, and that no figure represented that resistance more staunchly than Princess Anne. The Princess Royal had always been her mother's confidant, defender of duty over drama, a woman who walked the tightrope of public service with razor-sharp discipline. Camilla, to Anne, wasn't merely an interloper, she was a deviation from everything the monarchy had fought to preserve. And that sentiment, whispered for decades, seemed to take material form in the Queen's final act. Inheritance, after all, is not just about possession, it's about succession. And Anne had inherited more than jewels, she had inherited symbolism. Royal historians have long pointed to quiet moments that hinted at this internal divide. Camilla was often positioned on the edge of balcony appearances, rarely standing shoulder to shoulder with the Queen. Her name was frequently omitted from internal communications during Elizabeth's final years. Even invitations to key private ceremonies, intimate gatherings meant to convey continuity, often included Anne, but not Camilla. At the time, these were dismissed as logistical oversights. Now, in retrospect, they appear deliberate. A particularly revealing glimpse comes from a set of private letters exchanged between Queen Elizabeth and a former lady-in-waiting, unearthed years later by an anonymous source. In them, the Queen refers to Anne as her true daughter-in-arms, a phrase never publicly uttered but clearly loaded with meaning. It spoke to a bond forged not from bloodlines alone, but from shared duty, unshakable discretion, and a lifetime of unwavering loyalty. Camilla, meanwhile, had fought for decades to shed the shadow of scandal, yet the shadow never quite lifted. In recent months, Camilla's exclusion from subtle but powerful rituals has only deepened her sense of isolation. When Anne laid a single wreath on behalf of the family during a closed-door tribute to the Queen, royal watchers noted that Camilla had not been invited. When new royal portraits were commissioned post-Elizabeth, Camilla's inclusion was reportedly optional, a detail that stung. With each omission, the message grew louder. Legitimacy may be granted publicly, but it is withheld privately. This, then, was not just about the jewelry, it was about legacy. Was Camilla being punished for the past, or simply never truly accepted into the future? The nation's royal watchers were split. Some argued this was payback, an elegant form of retribution served cold and jewel-encrusted. Others believed it was a message, carved in silence, stating clearly that Anne, not Camilla, was the Queen's true heir in spirit. With pressure mounting, Camilla made a fateful decision to confront the past in hopes of reclaiming the future. They met in the white drawing room. No aides, no cameras, just decades of silence ready to erupt. What happened next was relayed in whispers, because no one dared speak it aloud. The meeting was neither scheduled nor ceremonial. According to palace logs, Anne arrived unannounced, and Camilla, caught off guard, dismissed her staff with a single nod. For years, their interactions had been civil, guarded, restrained by the invisible web of royal protocol. But that day, the gloves came off. It wasn't just about the jewelry anymore, it was about loyalty, legacy, and the one woman who had held the monarchy together through scandal, war, and transformation, the Queen. Raised voices were reportedly heard through the double doors, and though the palace later dismissed them as a spirited discussion, those present knew better. This wasn't a debate, it was a reckoning. Sources close to the staff claim that Anne, standing tall in defiance, uttered a chilling phrase that pierced through the corridors like a dagger. "You weren't there when she built this." A single sentence that distilled years of resentment. Camilla, by contrast, lashed out with rare fury, accusing Anne of undermining the unity of the family, of turning private mourning into a public spectacle. It was a confrontation long overdue, one that neither woman wanted, but both had seen coming. By the time Anne left the room, guards had been ordered to tighten hallway security, and media personnel were strictly instructed to steer clear of that wing. But the damage had already been done. Leaks, discreet, indirect, but unmistakable, began to surface, not just about the argument, but about its meaning. The firm, always so meticulously controlled, had failed to contain its internal firestorm. The staff began to fracture. Some rallied behind Anne, admiring her lifelong dedication and fearless candor. Others, loyal to Camilla's efforts to modernize and bridge old wounds, viewed Anne's stance as dangerously traditionalist, bordering on sabotage. And though no public statement was issued, every move that followed, every look, every absence, every reshuffled appearance, spoke louder than any press release could. The Queen's death had created a vacuum. But what filled it wasn't calm, it was confrontation. And while the cameras outside Buckingham Palace showed a united front, the real battle was unfolding within. Lines were drawn, not just between two women, but between two visions of what the monarchy was meant to be and what it could no longer afford to ignore. But while the crown stayed steady in public, it was what happened in the shadows that truly threatened the monarchy. When the inheritance leak hit the tabloids, the public split wide open. For some, Anne was the rightful heir to legacy. For others, Camilla had been betrayed. But one thing was clear, there would be no return to silence. The headline was impossible to ignore. Crown Jewels, Family War. Every morning show, podcast, and front page ran with it, dissecting every whispered quote, every sidelong glance, every archival moment that might explain how the Queen's most treasured jewels had ended up in Anne's vault and not Camilla's. Social media ignited. Within hours, Number Team Anne and Number Justice for Camilla were trending globally, creating a cultural fault line no royal advisor could bridge. The monarchy, once wrapped in mystery, was now laid bare before millions, judged not by tradition, but by public sentiment, and that sentiment was anything but united. For Anne's supporters, the evidence was simple and visceral: decades of service, unflinching loyalty, and a complete rejection of celebrity drama. She had never asked for the spotlight, but when it found her, she wore it like armor. Her legacy, they argued, was earned. Camilla, meanwhile, was painted by critics as an opportunist, someone who had spent years clawing her way into the inner circle, only to be denied the final symbols of arrival. But Camilla's defenders fired back, accusing Anne of weaponizing grief and breaking the silent code of royal unity. The palace's refusal to comment only deepened the rift. In interviews, historians began drawing stark comparisons. Anne, who rode with soldiers and visited crisis zones, versus Camilla, whose public image had been carefully managed, but never universally embraced. Even former royal aides anonymously weighed in, describing Anne as the spine of the crown, and recalling moments when her mother, the late Queen, deferred to her daughter with visible respect. The sentiment struck a chord. A new poll showed Anne's favourability had soared, especially among younger demographics, tired of spectacle and eager for authenticity. Still, the silence from Buckingham Palace was deafening. No clarification, no endorsement, no damage control. Just a void one that the press and public were more than willing to fill with speculation. Some wondered if Charles, cornered between loyalty to his wife and respect for his sister, had simply chosen to let the storm rage. Others believed the firm was unraveling by design, that perhaps, behind the scenes, deeper forces were at play. Either way, the monarchy's once unshakable wall of discretion was cracking, and through that crack poured a flood of questions, betrayals, and inconvenient truths. But just as the media frenzy peaked, a secret document emerged, and it changed everything. Sealed in a plain envelope, the Queen's handwritten letter surfaced under lock and key. Its contents: a quiet explosion of clarity, intention, and unfinished business. It wasn't supposed to be seen. Not yet. But somehow, somewhere within the gilded corridors of the palace, the envelope marked, "To my daughter." Anne was removed from its velvet-lined drawer and passed into hands outside the royal circle. A leak? A betrayal? Or perhaps, as some whispered, a final act of devotion by someone who believed the truth should never have been hidden. The letter, penned in the Queen's unmistakable cursive, didn't mince words. It was heartfelt, deliberate, and devastating in its honesty. It didn't just confirm Anne's inheritance, it explained it. Every jewel, every tiara, every brooch had been chosen not for ceremony, but for character. The Queen had made a conscious choice, and now the world knew why. The letter spoke of authenticity over perception, of Anne being the protector of our legacy in ways that few ever understood. It detailed memories of quiet resilience, of moments when the monarchy teetered and Anne stood tall, not for cameras, not for applause, but for duty. The Queen had watched her daughter weather storms the public never saw, and saw in her not just a child, but a kindred force. And it was that force, she wrote, that gave her peace when deciding who would carry forward the symbols that defined a dynasty. But there was more, an unmistakable reference to the danger of pageantry without purpose, a line many interpreted as a veiled comment on Camilla. The timing of the leak couldn't have been more volatile. Public emotion was already boiling. Social media was ablaze with speculation, outrage, and raw support. The letter acted like fuel thrown on an already roaring fire. Camilla, reportedly blindsided once again, was said to have broken down after reading it. Not in public, of course, but behind closed doors, among her most trusted aides. For years, she had fought to be accepted, had clawed her way into a family that never made space easily. And now, with one carefully chosen letter, the Queen had, at least in the public's eyes, rewritten the legacy Camilla thought she was building. Yet it wasn't just about Camilla. The entire firm was shaken, loyalty lines blurred, trust evaporated. Who leaked it? Why now? Some insiders believed Anne had nothing to do with the letter's release. Others weren't so sure. But what mattered more was the message, and the chilling clarity with which it echoed. This had been the Queen's wish. Not a mistake, not an oversight, a choice. But even as the Queen's words echo through the palace, a final twist was yet to come because Charles had a decision to make. Torn between the woman he loves and the sister he trusts, Charles faces a decision that could splinter the royal family or heal it. But time is running out. Behind the grandeur of palace gates, the crisis reached its boiling point. For days, Charles had remained publicly silent. But within those walls, his world was fracturing. The Queen's letter had unleashed more than hurt feelings, it had ignited a succession storm. Advisors moved cautiously, warning that silence would soon become its own statement. But Charles wasn't just weighing optics. He was grappling with something far heavier, the erosion of unity within the House of Windsor, and the devastating realization that any move he made would alienate someone he loved. So, he did what monarchs rarely do. He called them in. First, Anne. Then Camilla. No grand audience, no advisors, just raw, unfiltered honesty between three people carrying the burden of a crown. Anne, stoic and composed, made it clear. The jewels weren't just pieces of history. They were her mother's legacy. Returning them under pressure would betray everything the Queen had entrusted to her. Her words weren't defiant, they were final. Charles knew her well enough to understand. Anne doesn't bluff. Then came Camilla, emotional but resolute. She spoke not of entitlement but of respect, of a life built in service alongside Charles, of humiliation at being publicly cast aside. And then, the line that shifted the room, she reportedly said, "If I am only tolerated, perhaps it's time I step away." It wasn't a threat. It was exhaustion. Behind the scenes, palace aides scrambled to contain the fallout. Polling was skewing heavily in Anne's favour, but public sympathy for Camilla had grown as well. The nation watched as rumours of an impending constitutional standoff began to swirl. Some insiders even whispered of potential abdication conversations, though those claims remain murky at best. What was undeniable, however, was the cost of Charles's indecision. Tensions leaked into public events. Body language was dissected. Every silence became a headline. Meanwhile, discussions began on restructuring ceremonial responsibilities. There was talk of giving Anne greater prominence in state affairs, allowing her legacy to stand on its own, separate from Camilla's path as Queen Consort. It wasn't a resolution but a signal, a quiet beginning to something that might hold the family together just long enough to find footing again. And just when the monarchy seemed poised on the brink. Weeks later, Anne steps out wearing the Queen's favourite brooch at an event Charles attends alone. It's not just a fashion choice. It's a message. And it marks the beginning of a new royal reality. The air was heavy with symbolism, and the brooch glittered like a final word. Princess Anne, long the unshakable foundation beneath the monarchy's ceremonial weight, appeared without fanfare yet demanded every gaze. And beside her, noticeably absent, was Queen Camilla. Whispers had swirled for days, rumours of illness, of retreat, of a woman battered not just by the media but by betrayal. But no statement was issued. Instead, it was Anne who took centre stage, bearing the weight of legacy with unflinching composure. The brooch, Elizabeth's favourite, wasn't just an accessory. It was a declaration, silent, deliberate, and unmistakable. A new order was taking shape, not one of rebellion, but of reckoning. In the weeks following Charles's tense private meetings with both women, subtle shifts began surfacing. Ceremonial roles were redistributed. Anne, who had always preferred duty over spotlight, was now stepping into a role the palace quietly labelled legacy stewardship. A title with no precedent and immense power. Public engagements that once bore Camilla's name were now led by Anne, often accompanied by Charles, but never by Camilla. The shift was smooth, but not silent. Speculation exploded across headlines. Where is Queen Camilla? Has Anne become the new matriarch of monarchy? Behind the veil of dignity, a quiet arrangement had been reached. Camilla would retain a select number of personal pieces from the Queen's collection, ones gifted to her directly, ones with emotional ties. The rest, including the most historically significant, would remain with Anne, not as property, but as guardianship, a compromise not of defeat, but of preservation. And in the court of public opinion, the outcome was overwhelming. Polls soared in Anne's favour. Royal watchers hailed her as the embodiment of continuity and integrity. Even critics admitted grudgingly that she had honoured the Queen's legacy without exploiting it. In contrast, Camilla's absence only deepened speculation. Was she sidelined? Or had she chosen silence over spectacle? The truth, perhaps, lay somewhere in between, but for the monarchy, what mattered was survival and symbolism. The crown had weathered the storm, but not without scars. The brooch shimmered again days later, this time during Anne's visit to a military installation, a nod to her mother's lifelong patronage. She didn't speak of inheritance or controversy. She didn't have to. The message was embedded in every detail. The transition wasn't just from one generation to another, it was from image to intent, from ceremony to substance. Anne had not only inherited jewels, she had inherited judgment, responsibility, and the moral authority of memory. And in doing so, she reminded the world that power in the House of Windsor doesn't come with coronets, it comes with conviction. Because in the House of Windsor, power isn't just worn, it's wielded. And sometimes, inheritance is the beginning of a revolution. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.